Deadly sin number 6 is gluttony. Now, I want you to know something. As we're moving up the 7-story mountain, we started with pride. The more serious of the deadly sins are the more spiritual ones. You know what I'm driving at? They're tied to the spirit in a way. The higher you go, the more they're tied to the body. The church kind of recognizes these are weaknesses of the flesh. And see, avarice is kind of like that. So is sloth. But now, especially as you're getting higher on the mountain, it's where the bodily sins have taken over. They're less serious. Deadly, don't belittle them, but they're less deadly. Gluttony. Are we an overfed country? Yeah, I think it's fair to say we are. I just saw my doctor and my physical, and I'm in good shape, thank God. But you know that thing when you actually get on the scale at the doctor's office, and I used to have a scale in my room. I got rid of it a while ago. But you get on the scale in the doctor's office, and you actually hear the nurse say what you weigh. You're like, oh my gosh, And so I saw the doctor, and I said, oh gosh, doctor, I'm heavier than I want to be. And he goes, well, you're eating when you're not hungry. And it's true, isn't it? A lot of us eat when we're not hungry. We eat just for pleasure. We eat for whatever. Is it a psychological issue? Yes, to some degree. A physical issue? Sometimes, sure. But here we're talking about it as a spiritual issue. Here's Aquinas again. What's gluttony? It's an immoderate or unreasonable pleasure in food and drink. Gluttony is taking an immoderate or unreasonable pleasure in food and drink. As such, it's related to avarice. It's a kind of concupiscence. It's trying to fill up this emptiness which only God can fill, right? It's a type of pleasure. If I just get enough pleasure, I'll be happy. I'm missing pleasure in my life. That's my problem. So I will drink too much. I'll eat too much. See? Now, mind you, Catholics aren't Puritans. Don't misconstrue me on this point. We have nothing against the pleasure of food and drink and sex and so on. You know the great line from Hilaire Belloc, which I'm sure you've heard, but wherever the Catholic sun does shine, there's music and laughter and good red wine. Good. That's right. We're not Puritans. In fact, I think Puritanism is a form of corruption, of spiritual corruption. So we like the pleasures of the body. Nothing in the world wrong with them. But it's this inordinate, immoderate, or unreasonable pleasure in these things that's a problem. Augustine's dictum comes to mind very much. Lord, you made us for yourself. Think of all desire as a kind of sacrament of this fundamental restlessness of the soul. Here's Thomas Merton, one of the great spiritual masters of the last century. Merton said, the desires of the flesh are a bit like children. Parents know about this. When kids want what they want when they want it. Mommy, I want this, I want this, I want this. Now, now, now. And if you indulge the kids' every desire, what's going to happen? In time, they're going to run your whole life. And I've seen, especially young parents, fall into this trap. Do you realize how the kids are utterly dominating this entire house? Because you're indulging every one of their desires. So Merton said the desire for food and drink and sensual pleasure can be like that. I want it, I want it, I want it, now, now, now. And if you don't discipline them, they will soon be running the house. See, that's the trouble with gluttony in all its forms, is now sensual desire so runs the house that I've forgotten about mission, I've forgotten about purpose, I've forgotten about prayer, I've forgotten about rightly ordering my life. That's the trouble with gluttony. Think of the devil's temptation here to the Lord. Turn these stones into bread. See, it's a temptation to gluttony, to make pleasure, sensual pleasure, the center of your life. And the Lord's great rejoinder is still an important one for us, right? We don't live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. See, gluttony as a deadly sin is trying to live by bread alone, by pleasure alone. It can't work. What's the antidote to gluttony? The classic term here is asceticism. Asceticism. Denying oneself food and drink and sensual pleasure for the sake of focusing the soul. Right? So not Puritanism, not that. Like, oh, these are terrible things, I have to just flee from them, or I have to escape from them to a pure spiritual realm. That ain't it. We look forward to the resurrection of the body, right? The body is good, meant for salvation. But for a time, we limit sensual pleasure. so as to awaken and focus spiritual desire. That's why John Henry Newman talks about asceticism as a basic principle of Catholicism. When we forget that, see, my generation tended to forget it. After Vatican II, I came of age right after the council, is we were so down on that. I mean, it seemed puritanical, it seemed world-denying, body-denying. So we didn't emphasize asceticism. But it's a sign of a healthy Catholicism. I think he's quite right about that. Here's a story. Scott, I think your time, you guys went to the Holy Land, didn't you? For our third-year men at Mundelein go for a long sojourn in the Holy Land. And they're there for 10 weeks. Well, one year a class arrived, and their arrival coincided with Ramadan, the Muslim month of prayer and fasting. What struck our students when they got home, they told me this, was you knew the minute you got off the plane that it was Ramadan. It was just in the rhythm of people's lives. It was in their way of relating. It was in their behavior. You knew something of spiritual significance was going on. And then it prompted in my mind this question. If someone arrived, let's say, from the Middle East to Chicago during Lent, largely Catholic Chicago during Lent, what would they notice? My guess is they wouldn't notice much at all different. We're not very good at asceticism. But spiritual people from time immemorial and across the religious lines have seen the significance and purpose of it. And so, practical advice, fast. One of the great practices of Lent is fasting. I'm not good at fasting. I'll confess it to you. It's a spiritual practice I have a hard time with, which is why I should do it more. And I mean not some wimpy little fast, but I mean a real serious fast. Skip a meal, perhaps on the Fridays during Lent. Maybe skip lunch altogether. Spend the hour in prayer instead of eating. Maybe give the money you would have spent to the poor. Don't go out drinking some night you wanted to and pray the rosary instead that night. Go away from the table during Lent feeling hungry. Good advice medically, yeah, every doctor says it. It's also good advice spiritually. Go away from a meal regularly during Lent feeling hungry. All right, I'm going over a little bit, I'm sorry. One more, though. One more. The sin you've all been waiting for, the sin of lust. Years ago, this friend of mine said, I suffer from glust, which is a combination of gluttony and lust. Glust. Now, again, here, it's difficult to talk about this in a Catholic context because we have the reputation of being obsessed with sex, obsessed with sexual sin. I'm Irish. I'm all Irish, both sides of my family. And there's something in the Irish formation that became maybe a little too preoccupied with this. But once again, we should not fall into Puritanism. The Catholic tradition reverences sex, including sexual pleasure. Nothing in the world wrong with it. In fact, that's why we protect it so carefully. Do you know, it's funny how this thought occurred to me a couple years ago. Usually once a year I go to Wrigley Field to watch the Cubs. I mean, God help me, I'm a Cub fan. Talk about a spiritual asceticism for many years. But I got to Wrigley Field, and Wrigley Field is one of the great gems of baseball, the beautiful old stadium. And man, is it protected. When you arrive at Wrigley Field, you can't just walk in. Of course you give them your ticket, but there's all sorts of ways. It's like getting on an airplane. I mean, you have to go through metal detectors, and they check your bags and all this stuff. Well, why are there so many rules around Wrigley Field? Because it's so beautiful and so precious because we love it so much. Of course we're surrounded by rules. You Catholics are hung up, all these rules about sex. Well, yeah, of course there are, because we love it, and we reverence it so much. That's the right way to look at it. What does lust mean? It doesn't mean sexual pleasure. Lust is a distortion of the sexual desire. I can define it very simply. Using another human being as a means to your sexual pleasure. It's the use of another human being as a means to your own sexual vocation. That's a principle, by the way, that John Paul used a lot in his moral writings. It's this principle, it goes back to Immanuel Kant. One of the forms of what Kant called the categorical imperative is never use a human being as a means, but always treat a human being as an end. It means someone to be reverenced in him or herself and can never be reduced to the level of a means to your pleasure. See, that's lust. That's lust. Go to Times Square sometime. When you go to New York and you walk into Times Square and you look up, and I always think like if an ancient person came back in a time machine, they'd think these are our gods, because up in lights, these giant figures of semi-nude, men and women, but what is that? But it's just this sort of hymn of praise to sexual pleasure for its own sake. How it dominates our society. You don't need me to tell you this, but pornography is a rampant spiritual problem in our society. I know it dealing now with these young guys, people in their 20s, in a way that my generation never was, but the internet happened. Now, you know what the average age, I got this from an expert who deals with sexual dysfunction stuff. You know what the average age for the first exposure to internet pornography is in our country? 11. I'm not kidding, and I see it confirmed all the time. 11. Mostly young men, of course, have a greater proclivity, but women too. 11 is the average age of the first exposure. And you give that to an 11-year-old, what happens? Almost immediate addiction. And we've done studies of how the brain gets changed and wired by this exposure to pornography. You well know this, that way beyond AT&T and McDonald's, and name the biggest corporations, is the pornography industry. Multi-billion-dollar industry in America. What is that but now an institutionalized lust, which is deeply perverting the minds and spirits and hearts, especially of our young kids? And will that have radiating effects throughout the rest of their lives? Yes. Don't think, it's a little minor problem, I can compartmentalize it. It is not a minor problem. That's a deadly sin. And the deadly sins have a way of radiating out and causing trouble everywhere. Remember C.S. Lewis's image of the convoy of ships moving along together, and they're all to one purpose? Even get one ship off kilter, what happens? The whole convoy gets messed up. That one ship off kilter, they're all going to crash together eventually. If this side of life is not under control, it'll cause trouble. What's the antidote to lust? Well, chastity is the classical term. What's chastity but an upright expression of one's sexuality? No matter what your form of life is, you're married, you're single, you're celibate, etc. It's an upright expression, a morally correct expression of sexuality. One that always involves the profound respect for the personhood of the other. That's what's at the heart of chastity in all of its expressions. Practical advice? Mind you, with John Paul kind of haunting me over there in the corner, when John Paul famously said that lust can take place within marriage, he was roundly criticized. But that's perfectly right, it seems to me. Perfectly right. That even married couples can treat each other as means and not as an end, can treat each other with disrespect sexually. Nothing surprising to me about that. Here's some practical advice. If you have pornography in any form, get rid of it now. And, I say it, I know as I say this, I'm addressing most people in our society. It's not some little minor thing off on the side. It's impacting a lot of people. If you have any pornography in your life, get rid of it. If the computer is a problem, get rid of it. It's better, right, to be thrown into Gehenna with one leg than to go with both legs into heaven. I mean, if this thing is causing such a problem, get rid of it. Don't cooperate with the pornography industry. And it's across the board, isn't it? All sorts of ways it draws us in. Stop cooperating with it. If you're involved in any kind of manipulative sexual relationship, and you know what I'm talking about. I mean, we're all in danger of this. Cut it out. If you're involved in some kind of manipulative sexual relationship where you're using another person for your own sexual pleasure, stop it. Cut it out. It's a deadly sin. Eliminate it. Okay, let me just close. I'm sorry I went on a little bit too long. Let me just remind you of the 7 sins and the lively virtues. So, the first one, the worst one, the most serious, pride. Pride. What's the antidote? Humility. Stay close to the humus, the earth. Second one, envy. A friend of mine succeeds, something in me dies. That's bad. Overcome it through admiration. Learn to admire in yourself and others. Third sin, anger. You all know you're angry at somebody right now. Antidote, do something this Lent to forgive. Heal the relationship. Fourth, sloth, laziness of the soul. Overcome it by zeal for the mission. Find out what God wants you to do and do it. Next, avarice. It's overcome through generosity. Give something away this Lent. Get in a habit of generosity. Gluttony, the unreasonable desire for food and drink. Overcome through a healthy asceticism. And finally, lust is overcome through chastity. Get our sexual lives, everybody, in order. Be aware of the 7 deadly sins. Practice the 7 lively virtues. Good Lenten stuff, and helps us to be spiritually healthy. God bless you all. Thanks for listening today.